and the car, and it can't move because we're, stuck in our, whatever our particular psychological.
So we're talking about the main thing being transcending our ego.
Well, enlightenment is about transcending ego, whether it's what I call the traditional enlightenment or the new evolutionary enlightenment. What makes everything happen is transcending ego. But in this particular case, we have to transcend ego so that the process can evolve through us.
Yeah. And do you feel it's possible to fully transcend the ego?
To fully transcend the ego? I mean, I think in most cases...
I'll personalize it. Do you think you've fully transcended your ego?
Definitely not. I think that... I think that in most cases it's a matter of relative transcendence. So in the way I've come up with a very simple model in order to give us a kind of a working understanding of how it actually does work. So because it's a very confusing question of what it means to transcend ego, and most people have no idea what it really means, including a lot of spiritual teachers, in my opinion. So the way to understand this is, let's say arbitrarily, the sum total of the self, whatever the self is 100%. Okay? So the sum total of the self is 100%. So let's say there is an individual who is 99% completely lost and trapped in the perspective of the psychological self and the culturally conditioned self. But to 1%, they're awake to what I'm calling the evolutionary impulse. That means if you bring up the notion of the evolution of consciousness, they'll light up. They say, what is that? They're turned on. If you meet them at a spiritual bookstore, or you meet them at a talk, or you meet them at a gathering. But you could meet them 5 years later, and they won't have changed at all. They're still very interested, but they won't evolve because 99% of the sum totality of the self is trapped within the psychological self and the culturally conditioned. They're only awake 1%.
Yeah.
So let's say
it's a spark, but no more than a spark.
Yeah, exactly.
Somehow.
So let's say you meet someone else. You meet them and you say, wow, they must be enlightened because they're 10% awake to what I'm calling evolutionary impulse or authentic self, and they're 90% still trapped within the psychological self or the culturally conditioned self. So they're 10% awake. So that's powerful. If you meet someone that's that awake, they know something about consciousness, from their own experience. But if you meet them over time, they're still fundamentally haven't changed. They're awake to something, but they're not really changing. And you can see because of the equation, the weight. In other words, who has dominion over the body and the mind and the soul. In this case, it's still going to be the individual, the psychological ego, and the culture and the culturally conditioned ego. So when it goes 1% to 10% to 30% to 40% to 45%, if you meet someone that's awake to the evolutionary impulse, spiritual impulse, authentic self, 45%, that there are spiritual teachers that could be powerful and charismatic characters, but they're still fundamentally trapped within the world of the individual or collective ego. In other words, that's still the stronger half. So the way I see that is what we want to aim for is crossing the 50% threshold. So we want to cross from 50 to 51. When we cross the 50% threshold and get to 51%, everything changes then, because then who has dominion? Who's the stronger half? Who has dominion over the body and the mind and the soul and the personality? Just 1 second. It becomes then the evolutionary impulse, and that becomes the stronger half. And so once someone crosses the 51% threshold, that's when there's a backdraft. That's when you could say the energy of consciousness itself is propelling them, and there's a kind of, and their own personality begins to express a certain kind of unself-conscious spontaneity, because where they're coming from doesn't have to do any more fundamentally. It doesn't come from will or effort or mindfulness or a certain kind of self-control. The spontaneity of consciousness itself begins to work through them. And once 51% is the whole, in an ideal world, is the short-term realizable goal by anybody who's very serious. Now, 51% is a big deal. You're not going to meet a lot of people that have gotten 51%. But once we get to 51%, if we do, then we want to get to 60, 70%. And if we do, then you'll see that the ego, the psychological self and the culturally conditioned self now are the weaker half.